In a decade dominated by boy bands on MTV, oversized flannel shirts, frosted tips, and the first shaky steps of the internet, the 1990s also left behind a long trail of regrettable cars that sputtered, creaked, and wheezed their way across the highways and city streets of California, Oregon, and Washington. It was an era of tech breakthroughs and creative booms, from the rise of Silicon Valley's dot-com startups to Seattle's grunge rebellion. But for every leap forward in music or digital culture, there seemed to be a backward stumble in the automotive world. Nowhere was this more obvious than on the West Coast, where car culture is not just utilitarian, but woven into identity and lifestyle. From late-night street races in the San Fernando Valley to slow cruises through Portland's Pearl District, cars have always meant something more out here, which made it all the more painful when the vehicles on offer were duds, lemons, and design disasters. Some were laughably underpowered, others were safety hazards on wheels. A few were so bland they became invisible the moment you stepped away from them. But all of them, in one way or another, became iconic for the wrong reasons. They weren't just bad cars. They were 90s bad cars, and they've stuck in the collective memory of West Coast drivers ever since. The decade kicked off with a clunker carried over from the tail end of the 80s, the Chevrolet Beretta. General Motors tried to sell it as a performance coupe for the masses, something sleek and vaguely aggressive, a car you might picture parked outside a roller rink or cruising Ventura Boulevard with the windows down. But in reality, the Beretta was mostly smoke and mirrors. The paint had a habit of peeling under the California sun like a week-old sunburn. The interiors didn't age gracefully, they disintegrated. The dashboard plastics cracked, the upholstery tore, and the entire car began to squeak and rattle like a junk drawer every time you hit a pothole. Structurally, it felt about as sturdy as a soda can. And when you saw one in motion, often struggling up the grapevine or barely merging onto Highway 101, it was usually trailing exhaust, held together by little more than inertia and duct tape. Still, there was something tragically endearing about the Beretta. It was a car for kids who wanted to look cool but couldn't afford a Mustang. For many teenagers in the early 90s, it was their first taste of freedom. Brief, wheezy, and loud. Another leftover from the late 80s that somehow limped into the 90s was the Sterling, a wildly optimistic, wildly miscalculated attempt by British carmaker Rover to win back the hearts and wallets of American drivers. After years of flops and fading relevance, Rover figured they could charm their way back onto U.S. roads by targeting the rising stars of Silicon Valley, those up-and-coming tech folks who needed something a little more sophisticated than a Civic, but maybe not quite ready for a Benz or a BMW. Enter the Sterling, with its polished wood trim, plush leather seats, and a name that sounded like it belonged to a Bond villain or a yacht. Here's where it got weird. The Sterling was actually a rebadged Rover 800, which itself was a rebadged Acura Legend, except it had gone through enough layers of rebadging that it felt like a game of international telephone. By the time it reached the States as the 825 and 827 models, it was essentially a third-generation copy of a car that had already found success, but without the quality or reliability of its source material. The idea was to blend Japanese engineering with British style, and in theory, that sounded great. In practice, not so much. The Sterling rolled into dealerships with a full set of problems straight off the lot. Electrical issues, mechanical faults, and all kinds of gremlins that turned brand new cars into driveway ornaments. And while the brochures promised a luxurious interior, real-world owners discovered that the California sun wasn't kind to those fancy materials. Leather seats cracked, faded, and in some cases, even turned a suspicious green, while the air conditioning gave up just when you needed it most, like on the 101 in July. Unsurprisingly, American buyers weren't thrilled about paying premium prices for cars that couldn't handle a weekend trip to Napa without throwing a fit. Word got around quickly, and the Sterling's reputation tanked harder than a blown radiator. By 1991, after just a few painful years, the brand quietly exited the U.S. market, never to return. The whole episode now lives on as a cautionary tale. Just because you slap some wood trim on a dashboard doesn't mean you're ready to compete with Lexus. Following close behind on the list of regrettable rides was the Ford Tempo, a car that by the early 90s already felt like it had missed its moment. While Detroit clung to it as a reliable family sedan, drivers on the West Coast knew better. The Tempo handled like a sofa on wheels, with an underpowered engine that strained under the pressure of even modest freeway acceleration. Its 4-speed automatic transmission made every gear change feel like a negotiation, and the ride quality was best described as medicated. The steering was loose, the suspension numb, and the entire driving experience could be compared to piloting a large appliance. In a city like Los Angeles, where stop-and-go traffic is a daily ritual and aggressive lane changes are a survival tactic, the Tempo was not just impractical, it was a liability. But you didn't buy a Tempo. You inherited it. It was passed down from an uncle, left behind by a roommate, or handed over in a quiet driveway transaction where no one made eye contact. Across the East Bay and the San Fernando Valley, high school parking lots were filled with Tempos, often adorned with bumper stickers, trying desperately to inject some personality into an otherwise forgettable machine. If you learned to drive in a Tempo, you learned patience, and probably how to jumpstart a dead battery in under 30 seconds. By the mid-90s, just as Bill Clinton was settling into the White House and grunge was giving way to boy bands, Chrysler dropped what would become one of the most ridiculed compact cars of the decade, the Dodge Neon. Its arrival was marked by one of the most bafflingly simplistic ad campaigns of the era. Just the word "hi" printed in bubbly font on its front bumper. It was meant to be cute, approachable, even charming. What buyers got instead was a brightly colored box full of shortcuts and compromises. The Dodge Neon seemed like a good deal on paper, affordable, efficient, and vaguely sporty in its base form. But that promise unraveled almost immediately. Owners quickly discovered that the head gaskets were prone to failure, the paint faded faster than sidewalk chalk, and the interiors felt like they'd been designed by a committee of interns. The doors closed with a hollow clunk. The windows fogged, the dashboard warped in the sun. Even in coastal California's mild climate, the Neons aged like milk. But perhaps what sealed the Neon's fate in the eyes of many West Coast drivers was its omnipresence in low-rent rental car fleets and student lots. In and around college campuses, UCLA, UC Santa Cruz, Cal State Fullerton, you'd see rows of Neons, sun-bleached and listing slightly to one side, with their once peppy engines reduced to a weak whine. It wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of cutting corners and settling for less. Meanwhile, over at Geo, things were getting weird. The brand was deep into what could only be described as a full-blown identity crisis. Born from a partnership between General Motors and Suzuki, Geo seemed unsure whether it wanted to compete with Toyota, charm budget-conscious drivers, or simply exist as a placeholder on dealer lots. It offered a lineup of vehicles, the Metro, the Prism, the Tracker, that felt like they had been designed in a rush, pitched in a boardroom meeting nobody wanted to attend, and shipped out without a second thought. Each model came off the line looking like a question mark on wheels. It was as if Geo engineers were trying to answer something vague like, what if a car didn't need personality, power, or presence? The Geo Metro in particular became the poster child for low-cost mediocrity. It was tiny, light, and yes, incredibly fuel efficient, often pushing 40 or even 50 miles per gallon, which was impressive, but it came at a steep cost in every other department. With all the structural strength of a soda can and about as much sound insulation, the Metro wasn't so much a car as a rolling tin box with seats. Driving one onto the 405 freeway in Los Angeles wasn't a commute. It was an act of pure faith. Drivers had to floor the gas pedal just to reach the speed limit and then pray that a semi didn't appear in their rearview mirror. The car's paper-thin doors, vague steering, and dismal crash test results made it infamous. Car enthusiasts and even casual drivers gave it nicknames like Speed Bump with cup holders or Urban Death Trap, and neither title felt like an exaggeration. Yet somehow you'd still see them zipping around Echo Park or sputtering through the San Fernando Valley, often with a missing hubcap or a sagging bumper held on by duct tape. If the Metro was a slow-motion mistake, then the Suzuki X-90 was a fast track to the surreal. A two-seat SUV coupe convertible that defied all logic, the X-90 arrived in 1995 and was greeted with a collective, "Wait, what is that?" It was short, squat, and cartoonishly bulbous, with the profile of a jelly bean and the practicality of a pogo stick. No one could tell whether it was supposed to be sporty, rugged, or just a visual prank. Some cars are polarizing. The X-90 was universally baffling. You might have seen one parked crooked at Venice Beach or used as a promotional giveaway by radio stations desperate for attention. Comedians joked about it on late-night TV. It looked like something you'd win in a game show and then immediately try to trade for a used Camry. And to make matters worse, Suzuki's safety reputation during that period was, to put it gently, not reassuring. The X-90's crashworthiness was questionable. Its performance was underwhelming, and its appeal was non-existent. It disappeared from showrooms quickly, but even that was too slow for many. Around the same time, Korean automakers were beginning to establish a presence in the U.S. market, and they did so with a mixture of aggressive pricing and questionable quality. Kia's first American release, the Sephia, arrived with the promise of affordability. It was supposed to be the ideal car for broke students, new grads, and working-class commuters navigating the West Coast's sprawling suburbs. But once you drove it off the lot, the dream started to unravel. The Sephia was built to a price, and it showed in every detail, from its plastic-heavy interior and shaky suspension to its tendency to overheat or simply refuse to start on chilly mornings. Word spread quickly, and soon the Sephia became a punchline. In some Southland dealerships, urban legends surfaced of BOGO sales. Buy one Kia, get a second one free. No one ever saw proof, but the rumor was so believable that it didn't need to be true. Everyone knew someone whose Kia fell apart before the odometer hit 50,000 miles. Hyundai, too, was struggling to find its footing. The Excel, an early entry into the economy market, looked decent on paper and offered a low price tag that tempted plenty of first-time buyers. But its 81-horsepower engine was underwhelming, even by 90 standards. And any attempt to drive it up a West Coast incline, like Laurel Canyon or the Grapevine, meant listening to the engine wheeze in protest. Build quality was spotty, rust was a common issue, even in dry climates, and resale value was practically non-existent. Hyundai would eventually course-correct and become a major force in the auto industry. But in the mid-90s, the Excel was not helping their case. At the same time, the Brits made another go at charming American drivers with a freshened-up version of the Range Rover, the kind of SUV that oozed class, offered leather and wood in all the right places, and still promised to get muddy if you asked it to. It was the ride of choice for folks who wanted their vehicles to be as comfortable on Rodeo Drive as they were on a fire road in Big Sur. You'd think that after the whole Sterling debacle, remember that one? Rover might have taken a hint that American buyers don't love cars that spend more time in the shop than on the road. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The 1995 Range Rover, codenamed P38, looked the part. Sleek, bold, and packed with British charm, it offered real off-road chops, a plush interior, and just enough snob appeal to justify the price tag. But here's the catch. It rarely worked right. Under all that fancy trim and buttoned-up British attitude was a minefield of mechanical gremlins just waiting to ruin your day. The big issue? The 4.6-liter engine had a bad habit of blowing its head gaskets thanks to poor machining of the engine block. And by bad habit, we mean wallet-destroying engine-out repair jobs that could make a Mercedes mechanic blush. Then there was the infamous air suspension system, a marvel of engineering that tried its best, but usually failed. One day you'd find the car slammed to the ground like it had lost the will to live, and the next it'd be jacked up so high you'd need a ladder to get in. Not exactly ideal for cruising down the 405. It was less of a luxury feature and more of a mood ring on wheels. Despite all that, the P38 did manage to sell well enough to stick around until 2002, but its reputation took such a beating that Land Rover started sketching out its replacement almost as soon as it hit the showroom floor. These days, you'll still spot the occasional P38 lurking behind Land Rover dealerships up and down the West Coast, sitting flat on their suspensions, collecting dust and waiting for a miracle, or at least a new engine. In the end, the P38 Range Rover was like a tuxedo-wearing house guest who showed up with a flat tire, tripped over your dog, and spilled wine on your couch. You wanted to like it. You tried to like it, but it just kept letting you down. Of course, no rundown of 90s automotive flops would be complete without a shout-out to the Pontiac Trans Sport, one of the most bizarre minivans ever to grace America's roads. Nicknamed the Dustbuster van for its long wedge-shaped body and sharply sloped nose, the Trans Sport looked like something out of a low-budget sci-fi film. GM thought it looked futuristic. Consumers mostly thought it looked ridiculous. But the weird styling was just the beginning of its problems. Visibility was poor due to the awkward windshield angle, the driving position felt unnatural, and the dashboard was a confusing mess of oddly placed controls. More concerning were the minivan's safety concerns. Alongside its GM cousins, the Chevrolet Lumina APV and the Oldsmobile Silhouette, the Trans Sport didn't hold up well in crash tests. These vans folded alarmingly in frontal impacts, prompting safety advocates to raise alarms. And yet, they remained weirdly popular throughout suburban neighborhoods in California, Oregon, and Washington. Why? Because in the pre-crossover era, minivans were still the go-to solution for families who needed space, convenience, and sliding doors. The Trans Sport may have looked like a failed prototype, but it hauled kids, dogs, groceries, and beach gear just as well as any boxy Chrysler town and country. And for some parents, that was enough. By the late 1990s, things in the automotive world were beginning to show signs of real progress. Build quality was improving, safety standards were becoming harder to ignore, and even the ugliest designs were being reined in by focus groups and common sense. But before that wave of improvement fully landed, Ford managed to sneak in one last eyesore, the third-generation Taurus. It was a car that seemed designed more by theme than logic. Someone at Ford must have really loved ovals because they were everywhere. On the headlights, on the taillights, in the windows, across the instrument panel, and even on the air vents. If you could shape it like a bar of soap, they did. At a time when the industry was becoming obsessed with aerodynamics and fluid design, Ford overcorrected. The result was a vehicle that looked like it had been left in the sun too long and started to melt. Some drivers found it daring, even futuristic in a Jetsons kind of way. Others couldn't stop calling it the fish car. The design was so divisive that it became a running joke up and down the 405, where stuck-in-traffic drivers had nothing better to do than mock the car in the next lane. And then, on the more tragicomic end of the spectrum, there was Daewoo. The South Korean brand launched a very brief and very strange campaign to win over American drivers, targeting budget-conscious young people with an offer that sounded too good to be true. Their cars, the Lanos, the Nubira, and the Leganza, were aggressively priced, available in shopping mall kiosks and on college campuses, and came with 3 years of free maintenance. The message was clear. Don't worry, we know these aren't great, but we'll fix them for you. Mechanically, they were deeply flawed, underpowered, underbuilt, and awkwardly styled. They handled like grocery carts and aged like produce. From Santa Cruz to Santa Monica, they became the car you bought when you needed wheels fast and didn't care what those wheels were attached to. Unfortunately, that fast fashion model didn't work well with 3,000-pound machines designed to travel at highway speeds. Daewoo's U.S. ambitions dissolved almost as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind a trail of busted engines and angry mechanics. As the decade drew to a close, a more serious issue loomed larger: safety. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, better known as the IIHS, began publishing frontal offset crash test videos in the late 90s, and they sent shockwaves through the industry. Up until that point, many car buyers didn't fully realize just how poorly some vehicles performed in collisions. The footage was unambiguous and often horrifying. Minivans and SUVs crumpling like aluminum foil, steering wheels bending inward, crash test dummies flailing in slow motion. For families on the West Coast, where long road trips and freeway commutes are a way of life, these revelations hit hard. The image of your car disintegrating on impact wasn't just alarming, it was sobering. Vehicles like the Chevy Venture, Isuzu Rodeo, and even the Ford Explorer, once popular choices for suburban families and weekend adventurers, began to look less like reliable rides and more like death traps on wheels. Suddenly, that quirky compact SUV didn't feel so safe when you knew what it did in a 40-mile-per-hour crash with a Civic. The conversation around safety shifted from optional to essential, and the industry could no longer afford to ignore it. By the time the year 2000 rolled around, the absolute worst offenders of the 90s were already on their way out. Some had been discontinued after lackluster sales or mechanical failures. Others were slowly vanishing from the roads, rusting out in riverside driveways, or sitting half-covered in tarps behind mechanic shops. Japanese automakers, long known for their reliability, were tightening their standards even more. Toyota and Honda had not only solidified their reputation, they were dominating the used car market. European manufacturers began reclaiming some design credibility, especially in the luxury segments. And American brands were finally starting to accept that adding plastic body kits and fake vents didn't make up for decades of declining quality. The realization had begun to sink in. Just because you could slap a spoiler on a sedan didn't mean you should. So when people ask what the absolute worst car of the 1990s was, the answer isn't simple. On the West Coast, opinions vary widely. Some will point to the Dodge Neon, not just for its endless mechanical failures, but for the way it lured people in with a cute smile and left them stranded on the shoulder of the 10 freeway. Others will nominate the Suzuki X-90 purely for being a car that never should have existed in the first place. A Frankenstein blend of SUV and sport coupe that made no sense then, and even less now. Kia and Daewoo deserve dishonorable mentions for almost destroying their own reputations before they even had a chance to build one. But for many, the worst cars weren't necessarily the most unreliable or the most hideous. They were the ones that symbolized a lack of care. Vehicles built cheaply, sold cynically, and driven reluctantly. They represented a time when consumers were expected to lower their standards and smile about it. In the end, these cars serve as a reminder that not every trend is worth chasing, and not every cost-saving measure is a good idea. The 1990s weren't all golden years for cars. They were weird, unpredictable, and often deeply flawed, but in their own way, they were unforgettable. Whether you were crawling through LA traffic in a Taurus that looked like an egg or heading up the coast in a rattling Daewoo, these cars were part of the landscape. They filled the parking lots at In-N-Out, lined the streets outside Amoeba Music, and sputtered through Bay Area fog with their check engine lights glowing like tiny orange warnings from the future. Sagging headliners, cracked dashboards, faded paint jobs. They weren't just eyesores. They were part of the story.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 1 lines on X, we're here just for you.